Good morning. Welcome to day 2 of the symposium for being organized as part of IWE Online web resource, which we launched yesterday. The session which began yesterday is devoted to Indian graphics. And the minute we say graphic, it's not what you think it is. So those of you who are here for different reasons, doesn't quite mean what you think it is. Let's get that sorted out at the beginning in case there are disappointments and say, no, this is not what it is, what we thought it was and all that. We have 3 speakers. Crystal's talk you have heard, which set the scene yesterday evening. Shalini Srinivasan from Azim Premji, and one illustrator, graphic novelist, Jyoti Mittal, who's been here before. Some of you might remember of her when she came for a graphic novel workshop. So there is also, as part of today's session, a discussion which will bring together the academics and the practicing artist. So I'll now hand this over to Atul, who will be emceeing for the day. Atul, thanks.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, everyone. And once again, welcome to the IWE Online Symposium, day 2. And as sir mentioned, we have 3 sessions today. And one of them is post-lunch. The third session is post-lunch. Please make a note so that you don't have lunch and go back. Please stay around. The third session is post-lunch. And the first speaker for today, as sir mentioned, is Professor Shalini Srinivasan from Azim Premji University, Bangalore. And her lecture is titled History Making Heroes, 3 Cases and Some Questions. And before we begin with the lecture, may I introduce the speaker? And it gives me great pleasure to tell some of you, though most of us know that Professor Srinivasan is an alumna of this department. And she teaches English and writing at Azim Premji University, Bangalore. She did her PhD, as I mentioned, at the Department of English of the University of Hyderabad. And her research is on comics and graphic narratives. Shalini previously worked as a script writer and editor with the comics publisher Amar Chitra Katha. She also writes fiction for children and adults. Her books include Vanamala and the Cephalopod, Gangamma's Ghadiyal, and more recently, the picture books Shukat Thukat and The Case of the Missing Water. So may I now invite Professor Shalini Srinivasan.
Thank you all for having me here. It's very strange and a little intimidating to be at this end of the Ashish Hall. I've been used to being at that end of it. Anyway, hi everyone. I'm going to be talking today about 3 comics. This is, I should tell you, a work in progress, so feel free to butt in and tell me when I'm wrong. It's likely to happen. And what I'm really looking at is 3 sort of cases of the act of history making in Indian comics, right? That Indian comics, whether for children or adults, are deeply imbricated with history and discourses of the nation. It's now a truism, right? We all know this. Yet the nature of the history that's being constructed, right? And the kind of role it's playing in the public imagination, that remains contested. This paper examines 3 cases of Indian comics engagement with history making. The first one of these is Amar Chitra Katha's Shivaji, which is a comic from the 70s. Orijit Sen's River of Stories, which is a comic from the 90s. And Malik Sajad's Munnu, which is from 2015. In all 3 cases, the historic enterprise that these comics are engaging with is iconographic, right? It's abstracting place, persons, time. It may be focused on national and subnational identities, but it might, and in the case of Amar Chitra Katha particularly, it might be pedagogical in its concerns. One of the things I'm arguing today is that in all 3 cases, the act of making history confers upon its protagonist a certain kind of extra narrative significance, right? And I'm terming it heroism for lack of a better term. So could we then, how could we then imagine this ideal comics protagonist, right? This person who makes history. I should warn you, they are often men. So, and then how then do we think of history, right? If history is something which is made, constructed on the page, how do we then imagine this history that is being constructed? Right. So this is sort of some of the things I'm going to talk about today. Before we begin, there's a couple of things I'd like you to keep in mind. Right? These will sort of be lurking around in the way we're thinking of history and in the way history looks on the page of the graphic narrative. Right? The first is this, which is that in the graphic narrative, time and space are often conflated. Right? They are. As you can see in this comic, you can see how this is a panel from Munnu, and you can see how as Munnu is lying on his bed and drawing, time changes, right? So though the space across these three panels remains the same, time has progressed, right? So this is one thing to keep in mind because this is important for our reading, right? Time and space are often mixed up, conflated in the graphics medium. So this is the right, and what this means is that when we're talking about people who are making history, the idea of them making spatial changes is also often raised, right? So spatial when you look at these images, and I'm going to be showing you a lot of them, keep in mind also the kinds of spatial changes that are happening with them. That one, by the way, is from Orijit Sen's River of Stories, and we're going to talk about that image a little bit more. All right, and the second question, and this is one that we're going to return to at the end of the story, is the idea of history itself, right? Because comics are a visual medium, there's a certain amount of metaphorical work going on, and a lot of it is visual. Right? So when our protagonists think of themselves as making history, how are they imagining history? Right? What is this historical edifice that they are hoping to make, to construct, in some cases to deconstruct? Right? So that's the other sort of question I'd like you guys to keep in mind as we progress. All right, so let's start with our first case. Some of you have possibly read this comic. Have a lot of people read this comic? Okay, that's, I'm slightly, okay, thank you. All right, so even if you haven't read this comic, there is, I think, a fairly good chance that you have seen variations of this image of Shivaji. Have you guys seen that? Yes. Yes, okay, that's great. This, by the way, the art is by a guy called Malik, and the script is by a guy called B.R. Bhagwat. And this is Amar Katha number 23 in 1971, and it's followed rapidly by a series of other historical comics, right? This is the publication's first foray into what they think of as their history comics, and in some ways, I'll be arguing that Shivaji serves as a template for the kind of history that Amar Katha is going to continue to construct. Okay, wait, hang on. So before we talk about the image itself, I'd like you to also take a look at where this image is coming from. Right, the image of Shivaji that Amar Katha depicts on their cover is, you will see, bears a significant resemblance to the Shivaji drawn by Raja Ravi Verma in the 1890s. Right, this borrowing is fairly well documented. Lots of people who've studied Amar Kathas, including Kalin MacLean, Nandini Chandra, talk about the ways in which Amar Katha borrows its iconographies, its visual symbolism from Ravi Verma's work, right? But here I want you to notice a very particular thing, which is not the similarities, which are many, right? The similarity lies in the composition, the similarity lies in the kind of backdrop the story is in, the similarity lies a little bit in the way he's dressed, the horse, etc. But there's a couple of significant differences, right? If any of you would like to chip in now with the differences, you can. Oh, you can't see that very well, but there are in Ravi Varma's painting. Yes, so thank you, which is, you'll see importantly that Amar Chitra Katha Shivaji is followed by an army. Ravi Varma Shivaji has a couple of companions, right? So that sort of martial aspect to Shivaji becomes very important in the Amar Chitra Katha cover, right? The other thing you must have noticed is the way he holds his sword, right? His posture changes from someone who happens to be carrying a sword, going on a sort of relaxed kind of trip, to someone who is holding their sword up with intent, right? So there's and of course the coloring, right? The sort of the bright orange, fiery kind of sky is adding to this sort of martial image of Shivaji that Amar Chitra Katha is creating, right? So that's one thing I want you to keep in mind when we talk about the rest of the comic, because this martial, warlike Shivaji becomes very important as someone who's making history. You'll notice again that inside the comic as well, the Ravi Varma painting is recreated once more. Again, the composition is very similar, but the sword is retained as upright, right, as ready to strike. All right, I don't know if you can read this. Can you guys read this? Okay, wait, let me read it out for you. So, this panel, can you hear me? Yeah, so this panel tells you very clearly, right? It gives you dates, times of birth. It says, on the 19th day of February, in this year, etc., Shivaji is born. It also gives you a certain amount of historical context, right? You'll see it says, at the time of his birth, there's the great Mughal emperor of Delhi, there's the Sindhi Johar of the coast, etc. Right? So it's setting up both our protagonists and our antagonists in the narrative. Right? So, and you will see that in this case, it starts with what we would think of as a fairly traditional history, right? Dates, times, exact situation, the moment of birth. All right, so this is further along in the story. Shivaji has been born, he's grown up, he started carving out his own territory. And these two images here are samples of a motive that sort of strikes across the comic, right? The first image shows Shivaji traversing the countryside. And there's this sort of wide prospect, right? You can see him seeing the countryside. And I use this term deliberately to echo John Barrell's essay, right? And this is so you can see his sort of wide prospect view of the countryside is used to indicate the sweep of his territorial ambition. And also, and he says somewhere, right? He says this should belong to us, right? So that use of the should be, it tips us off here. It also indicates his historical ambition, right? We've said time and space are often conflated. And here in this kind of historical cum territorial ambition that Shivaji has, right? And the comic's narrative is really about him pushing through this ambition. So you can see you can see how the narrative sets up this conflation of time and space, and you can also see how it becomes a key marker of how Shivaji makes history, right? The second panel is also interesting to us because it's one of the many deliberate illusions in the comic, right? So here he is setting off to loot a boat, and it's and you know, it says, oh, he was hanging, and it says he was there for some time, he waited, then he looted the boat. But in actual fact, he didn't wait very long, right? I think it was just about a year. And And it should also be admitted that it takes significant narrative work to suggest that looting is a noble endeavor rather than looting, right? But in each case, you see that Shivaji is given a certain kind of agency, right? Because this is a comic that's working on our knowledge, on the reader's prior knowledge of Shivaji's existence, and proving over and over again that here is someone who has made history, right? Here is someone who's an architect of a certain historical moment, right? And the comic ends on this note. It doesn't end with his, again, this is a fairly significant elision, right? The comic jumps from Shivaji's escape from Aurangzeb's court to his coronation, right? There's a significant period of time that actually elapses between these two events, but on the comic's page, it does not, right? He escapes, he is crowned. You will notice in this panel that unlike the beginning, the markers of history of time rather are no longer there, right? We are not told when, we are not told what time of day, right? All of that information has been elided over. And this is our first clue, really, that in a panel like this, Shivaji and history have been sort of entwined in a way that renders any additional authentication, right? What did he do in between after escaping Aurangzeb? Or how did he become king? What did he have to do to be coronated? All of that has been rendered redundant, right? It is and in fact, the historical records show that quite a lot happens, right? There's negotiations, there's in fact a peace with Aurangzeb, there's a long-term ordering and reordering of political alliances, conflicts including about the coronation, conflicts with his son. But all of that the comic deems unnecessary, right? Instead, outwitting Aurangzeb becomes the immediate precursor to the coronation. And Shivaji's role in history becomes then this act of being coronated. This sort of sealing of his lordship over the territories that he has been viewing over the course of the comic. Right? So this gives us a very particular kind of view of history. Right? This is a comic which thinks of history as a sort of static moment and a moment of narrative culmination. Right? And heroism is tied to someone who sort of achieves this photo flash kind of moment, right? And this becomes a template for multiple Amar Chitra Katha histories, right? So, for instance, Akbar's comic ends with him on a quest for a universal religion. Ashoka's comic ends with him becoming Dharma Ashoka, right? So the historical narrative is tweaked into certain moments, right? Rather than thinking of history as a longer narrative process, history becomes constructed in these comics to specific moments. Coronations are a prime example, right? So in a sense, it looks as if history halts at this moment for Shivaji. Subsequent events in his life, for instance, are simply unnecessary, right? The comic just says, yes, he ruled for a very long time, it was important. And we are left at that. Right, so lots of people have talked about this moment, right? This act of ending history upon one significant moment. So Nandini Chandra, for instance, says this, right? She says that it's she reads this comic as sort of positing, and you must have noticed there's a lot of talk about freedom in this comic, right? Shivaji keeps talking about his endeavor as an endeavor of freedom. So she sees this as a sort of, Amar Chitra Katha's history comics, a sort of endless replaying of this kind of thing, right? The Indian, whoever he might be, is sort of permanently in conflict with some kind of foreigner. And the nature of this foreigner, of course, changes, right? It might be an asura in certain comics, it might be the Muslim rulers. Aurangzeb is a prime example in this. It might be the British. And Chandra, other people like Kali MacLean have argued that the child reader, and it's important here to notice that Amar Chitra Katha is written for children, right? The child reader is assumed to identify with Shivaji and to sort of see these history comics each as culminating in someone throwing off the shackles of a foreign power. Right? But, and it's important for us to note, since we're talking about history, that this kind of narrativizing of history, right, that's driven by a need for that immortal moment. Amar Chitra Katha, of course, means immortal picture story, makes this kind of narrative profoundly ahistorical, right? Shivaji becomes sort of frozen in stasis at that moment of his coronation, and he's not allowed to, his narrative does not allow to progress after that. So that's Amar Chitra Katha. We are going to jump a couple of decades now for our second case. This is Orijit Sen's River of Stories, right? Often considered the first graphic novel, etc., etc. Also interesting from a comics perspective as a one-person text, right? Amar Chitra Katha, Chanda Mama, other kinds of comics, most Western comics you've read, right? DC comics, Marvel comics, are creations of teams, right? There are different people doing different aspects of the work, and they become a sort of collective endeavor, right? But with what is often called the graphic novel, and Orijit Sen's book is a good example of that. It's a one-person text, right? There's one creator who's both artist and writer and letterer and designer, everything, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind, that there's a slightly greater unity of vision going on in comics like this. All right, so River of Stories, unlike Shivaji, has multiple protagonists, right? And each of these is indicated to us as a protagonist because they're telling us a story, right? So there is Malgu Gayan, who sings the myth of creation. You can see him there. There's Relku, who tells a story of modern life along the river Reva. And there's Vishnu, her employer and journalist, whose article helps conclude the story. All three of them, and River of Stories is working in the connection of building the Sardar Sarovar Dam on the river Narmada, aka the Reva. Right? And all three of our stories are, in a sense, telling us the story of this space. And the comic deploys distinct visualities for each teller. Right? So the mythic story, you can see with Malgu Gayan in the first image, is depicted, in fact, in a more realistic style. Right? It has fairly complex kinds of shading, it has a certain amount of depth, and very close attention is paid to the details of face and figure. And particularly this stands in stark comparison to the Vishnu story. Right? Vishnu is the journalist, urban, upper caste. And his visuality is much more what we would think of as the cartoon visuality. Right? It's flat, it's line-based art, it's sort of broken up, it's a boxy kind of narrative. And you will see that people's faces, features are drawn with significantly less detail. Right? There's not a lot of it works by suggestion rather than by actual filling in of color or line. Right? So just compare these two things. And one of the things you might notice is that Malgu is in full control over his narrative space. Right? You can see that there are no blanks, there are no gaps in the story he's telling. Right? Visually, it's a very rich, dense kind of story he has. In contrast, Vishnu, who is an outsider coming in, has a story with a lot more gaps. Right? There's a lot of white spaces, people are suggested rather than told as fully known. And he's not integrated with the story in the way that Malgu is. And we've said that this is a comic about the creation of a dam, right? This is a comic about the way the landscape changes when the dam comes. And one of the things that happens is that the people who live along the river valley, so there's this little conversation happening about midway through the comic, and they say, oh, but the landscape is changing, the mountains are changing, what do we do? And the answer, one of the other people says, is we should call Mulgu the singer, right? And the comic again changes to Mulgu's aesthetic, right? And Mulgu in fact sets off on this sort of slightly dreamy, folklore-tinged quest narrative, right? Where he has to find someone to make him an instrument, and there's a complicated story about him, 3 daughters, and so on. Right? So Reluka is sent to make an instrument. Eventually, Mulgu gets the instrument, and what he does with that instrument is that he starts to sing the space. Right? So this is actually a spread that extends over multiple pages and follows the flow of the river Reva right through, right, from its origins to the sea. And at each place, and I don't know how well you can see the details, but at each place, the story, Mulgu's story offers us a particularity to that location, right? Often these stories are mythical, sometimes they're fabulous, sometimes they're personal, occasionally, even as when the dam shows up, they are factual. But what Mulgu does, right, what our protagonist here does, is that he transforms that sort of bare kind of landscape into this, right? Something that is peopled with a multiplicity of stories. Right? Essentially, he's restoring that landscape that its inhabitants had felt was being stripped bare or had been changed. Right? So it's a different kind of act of history that Mulgu's doing. And of course, when we say history here, it's a different kind of past, right? It's a past that's being evoked through story, through fable, through myth. So, River of Stories, we could then argue, offers a sort of critique of the kind of realism that of the Amar Chitra Katha kind of comic style, right? And Amar Chitra Katha often, if you read interviews with the artists, they often talk about how it's a realist style, right? But here in this comic, the true realism is in fact given to the mythical narrative, right? And River of Story seems to suggest that that's more realistic than the comics kind of style. And that the mythic past is more real than the present also offers us a commentary on the nature of the history that this comic postulates. Right? This is a very complex history it postulates. It's tied into belief system, and it prioritizes both local communities and the landscape itself. Right? And you will notice that Shivaji's narrative role, right? Someone who's imagining a different future for the landscape and then creating that sort of transmissible image of it. That is now here divided among multiple protagonists. Right? So we can see that by 1991, comics history has started looking a little different. Right? This is a history which is tied more deeply to specificities of communities, specificities of landscape, and it's borrowing heavily from ideas of myth. Okay. So I'm going to skip over a little bit. And I'm going to just quickly talk about some of the effects that River of Stories has on subsequent comics, right? The first is that its focus on a multiplicity of narratives and visuals, and it should be noted here that Orijit Sen, like our next case, Munnu, is drawing also upon the comic, upon the graphic novels that were at that time being produced in America, right? So Mouse, Art Spiegelman's Mouse becomes something that he often references as important to the way he's thinking of visuality, right? Right, so River of Stories gives us some sort of things to keep in mind when we look at Munnu. One is the multiplicity of narratives. The other is that this idea that realism is tied with the mythic narrative rather than with the factual one. And finally, and this is a question I'm going to come back to at the end, what then is an Indian visuality, right? Because everything we've met so far is in fact borrowing heavily from multiple sources, often non-Indian. Right? And I just want to also suggest that this sort of river image, right? This river as carrying the story, the narrative through the river, gives us this idea, this much more fluid idea of history, right? Where Shivaji ended on the static image. This gives us an idea of history as sort of more of a continuity, right? Acting in some ways, acting over and over again. Right? I'd just like to note also that towards the end of the comic, Mulgu is asked to join the national mainstream, and he says no. Right? He says no. I'm quite happy on the banks of the river. And this is something I want you guys to keep in mind because this question comes up again in our next comic, which is Munnu. All right. So here's case 3. This is from Munnu by Malik Sajad, which is of the 3 relatively recent. You'll see that Munnu begins also with a kind of map, but it's not the same kind of map that we've seen in either Orijit Sen or in sort of Shivaji's prospect landscape, right? It's neither of those. Instead, it's much more personal because it begins with that sort of embedded picture of Munnu's family. You'll see also that there's a little hand pointing. It shows up there, right? So you'll see there's a little hand he uses pointing there, saying this is where we live. Right? So it's a very personalized kind of map that Munnu presents, right? And you will notice also that it's a map that, like with River of Stories, the kind of identity it deals with is not pan-Indian, but very specific, right? There's a specific subnational kind of identity it's dealing with. And you can see how the map sort of makes that very clear, right? It's Kashmir in white, everything else in darkened. So it's very clear about where the story is situated and also what history it is that is being told. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is the sort of aesthetics of this panel here, right? Sajad draws upon the woodworking motifs. His father is a woodcarver. So he draws upon those motifs to inform his art, right? So as we said, like Orijit Sen, he's someone who is influenced by Western comics, right? So he cites Joe Sacco, he cites Art Spiegelman as influences. But you can also see that he's because this is a comic so concerned with the Kashmiri identity, with that history, he's also using the aesthetics of that to depict his story. And you will see him, and this is one of many images that occurs, right? You see Sajad, that's someone actively working to create these images. Right, his hands show up in the map. Here he's sitting on that tree and carving it around him. So over and over again, Sajad depicts himself as someone who is deeply engaged in making. Yeah, this is so you can see the full spread, right? You can see there are elements of history. He tells you this happened then, this was then, but he also it's also woven in with the geography, right? This is where I live, this is where this happens, and so on. I should note here also that Munnu was not originally published in India, right? When we talk about who is this history written for, it's important to note that Munnu was originally published abroad, and I think there was a gap of 6 months, maybe longer, before it became available in India, right? So when Sajad is constructing the history of Kashmir, he's not constructing it, for us, right? He's constructing it for an international audience. And so much of the ways in which, including the maps, right, the careful maps, the careful evoking of a Kashmiri aesthetic, is designed to introduce Kashmir to someone to whom it's completely unfamiliar. Right? Munnu is also told, it's told in a limited third person, but of course the identification between the character Munnu and the artist Sajad happens towards the end of the story. But until then, the narrative speaks of the child Munnu with a great deal of familiarity, but as somehow distinct from him, right? But one of the, so various people, including, what's her name, Sridevi Sarkar, have talked about the use of autoethnography in this comic, right? Here's a comic in which Sajad is sort of telling his own story and that of his community along with him. And you will notice that one of the things that happens, because this is such a personal kind of story, is that the style often becomes the style often becomes abstract, the style often becomes expressionistic, right? This, for instance, is a nightmare that Munnu is having, right? And you can see how realism is sort of becomes entirely irrelevant to this story, right? Rather, what's important in this particular moment is the intensity of that nightmarish emotion. Right? So one of the things that's important about Munnu is that it's looking at history not as a sort of public thing to put up, right? Amar Katha does this. Orijit also does this. Rather, it's looking at history as a private kind of construction. Private and very particular, right? Something that is rooted in an individual, in this case in Munnu. Many of you might have also noticed that there's this running metaphor where the Kashmiri people are depicted as hangul deer, which are an endangered deer endemic to the Kashmir Valley. Right? Again, this, there's a lot to be said about this metaphor, but for us it's interesting that because this, again, creates a sense of distinction. Right? It creates a sense of, here are the people who this is a story of, everybody else is not a deer. So I want to talk briefly now about the way in which history is thought of in Munnu. So in some ways, we've seen that Munnu often thinks of himself as a maker of history, right? There's a lot of that motif going on in the story. Here's someone who's learning to draw, here's someone who's learning to carve, here's someone who's trying over and over again to construct narratives around the horrific things that happen in Srinagar as he's growing up. Right? We've said that this is a comic that uses both global kinds of influences and hyperlocal kinds of influences. And yet, by the end of the comic, Munnu becomes not just a maker of history, but also a destroyer of history. Right? So I don't know how clearly you can see these two images. They're both very black. But in the first one, Munnu has created an exhibit in the Habitat Center in Delhi. And he's briefly arrested. And he comes back to the Habitat Center. And of course, he's arrested for being Kashmiri, pretty much. Right? So he comes back to the Habitat Center, and he flings a stone. You can see the sort of trajectory of that stone, right? He flings a stone at his own history, destroying it. The second one happens right at the very end of the comic, I don't know if you can read this, so let me read it out. Right? He says that he wants to. And the second one is the moment where he goes from being Munnu to being Sajad. Right? So he says, Munnu was this sort of innocent person, but Sajad wants to build the things that's passing by. Right? That's passing by without fulfilling the kinds of goals that Munnu had. Right? So in some ways, over the course of this comic, our protagonist goes from someone who wants to make history to someone whose agenda with history is a little more complex, right? It's a little more thorned. Does he want to make it? Yes, because he wrote this comic. But he's also someone who's deeply upset about it, who's angered by it, who seeks to destroy it periodically, who wants to take his revenge on it for passing by. Right? I mean, you can see some similarities with Orijit Sen here, right? That given the sort of hegemonic nature of national histories, Munnu seeks in some way to contest this, right? He seeks both to set up his own alternate history, but also to destroy the edifice of mainstream history, let's call it. Okay, so some things just a quick recap, and some things you must have noticed are happening across our three comics, right? In Shivaji, we'll see that the gestures towards realism, right, by way of landscape, by way of costuming, become a mode of authenticating that history, right? Here we know this is Shivaji because he's dressed in that way all the time. We know this is Shivaji because he has that black horse with a white thing on it all the time, right? And the narrative's prioritization of static, iconic kinds of moments blurs the line between history and historical personage, imagining not the passage of time and character, but a set of sort of abstracted, iconic still images. Right? The history here, as many critics have noted, is deliberately posited as pan-Indian. Right? We are all asked to identify with Shivaji's desire for freedom against numerous other local kings, attempting to overcome the sub-national identities of both subjects and creators. Right? I'm not going to go into this now, but there's quite a lot of work about how the artists and scriptwriters working on Amar Katha try very hard to avoid what might be thought of as particularities of dress, of figure, of place, right? Because they want that kind of pan-national identity. In River of Stories, the use of multiple visualities to echo multiple voices suggests an attempt to create a more multimodal kind of history, right? A polyphony of both voice and visuality. Contrasts are built between the lush and painterly imaginaries of the people of the Reva Valley and the black and white sparsity of the narrative that Vishnu inhabits. Heroism here is granted to those like Malgu, who can tell their stories, who can participate in the act of history making that is unique to them. That sort of blurs landscape and history. And though local narratives are crucial, the transmissions of these stories relies partly upon the reporter, upon Vishnu who elicits them. Right? It's Vishnu who acts as an intermediary, carrying Malgu's stories into the mainstream, into the national mainstream. Right? And the mode, of course, that Vishnu uses is realistic, factual. Right? Munnu, the most recent of our three cases, turns both inward and outward. Right? Here the focus on a geographically and historically bounded space, peopled by the humble deer, creates a distinctive identity for the protagonists. Many of Orijit Sen's techniques that in turn borrowed from Spiegelman, etc., are deployed. Right? The use of regionally tinged visualities, the first-person narrator acting as both witness and historical actor, and the localization of the historical experience. There's a distinction between the insider, which is Munnu, right? Munnu is a sort of insider conveying the story of of Kashmir to the world, and the outsider, who's reading the story, but who also acts upon it in certain ways, right? Imprisoning our protagonist, for one. And yet, Munnu, perhaps unsurprising given the location of this comic, and let me return here to this. Right? I don't know if you can read it, but this is Munnu showing a tourist around, and she says, "Is that?" And he takes her to the museum, and she says, "Is that a museum? It's a bunker." And he says, "It's both." Right? And in some ways, this is the image of history that Munnu posits. Right? History both as something that must be preserved, must be guarded, but also something that's hedged, thorny, often hurtful. Right? And there's a certain kind of militaristic kind of aesthetic to that image. Right? And Munnu is also the most explicit in its demarcation of history and space as an artificial construct, right? As something that's both malleable and man-made, something that might be guarded and encircled like this, but also something to pit the protagonist pits himself against. So yeah, and across these we see that when we say comics history is a very wide kind of idea, right? It's not a factual, objective kind of history that, in fact, any of our comics are portraying, right? They are all tinged with what Joan Conrad describes as the story kind of right, as the sort of storied aspect of history, right, which includes folklore, includes myth, it includes all these other narrative categories that impinge upon our history here. So I'm going to end with a bunch of questions because I'm not sure yet how to think about this. And feel free to answer them if you think you know. Right? So my first question is this, that there appears to be a recurring feature, or perhaps a recurring bug, in Indian comics, right? And this occurs across readerships and times, that valorizes this ability to make history, right? To imagine it, to construct it, to iconize it, whether as a participant or as a sort of active witness, right? And I guess my question is this merely a sort of result of our post-colonial condition, or is there some kind of visual lineage also that we could construct among this? My next question is to do with comics themselves, right? Like there's a lot of work done about how closure is, and you guys can read, among other people, Hilary Chute, if you want to know about this. Is that the nature of comics make it apt to lend closure to these narratives, right? To positing images of history as sort of finished, done, right? Shivaji is a great example of that. Right? Is this something that is so tied to the comics narrative that it's difficult to imagine a different way of shaping this narrative, is my question. And finally, is comics history a museum or a bunker? And can we imagine it any other way? So, yeah, thank you. So, yes, if you have any questions or answers, please.
Thank you, Professor Srinivasan. The floor is now open for questions. Thank you, madam, for this informative presentation. One point that you had mentioned that the child reader is expected to associate with Shivaji. So that's true. I think that is true, but I also feel that it extends beyond the child reader. Just think of the major scooter brand that shares its name with the horse of Rana Pratap. So the ironic thing is that even a machine that is supposed to grant mobility, they are confident enough to even name that after the fragmented history, because no matter how much mobility you get, they are sure, because this version of history has spread so much throughout the entire subcontinent and so deep into the psyche that it doesn't actually matter.
Wait, I'm sorry, could you just say what your question is?
No,
Because
no,
I'm sort of agreeing with you.
Yeah,
No, I mean, I pretty much agree with you. I will add only that, I think what's interesting is the way in which a variety of popular narratives, including comics, have sort of contributed to creating this one image of Rana Pratap, this one dominant image of Shivaji, things like that.
The first question, I don't have an answer, but I just wanted to ask if you think it is memory impinging on history in a way, in the last two narratives we talked about. And in the first one, it is a more iconic kind of history which is portrayed. And do you think that would be an answer in a way to see how memory impinges on, in the current way of looking at things? Or do you think there is an answer there?
I think certainly. I think particularly with the narrative like Munnu, which is so dependent on the individual subjectivity, on the way that creator has experienced history. I think with something like Munnu, I think memory is a good place to sort of start thinking about history. With River of Stories, of course, memory is one thing, but it's not an individual memory that really is being created, right? It's more a kind of collective of memory. So, that's.
Hello, ma'am. I don't know if it's a question of sorts, but so if you look at the three examples that you put up, the first one being Untitled Chapter, there is a definite idea of reading or trying to canonize in a particular character in history, right? And then you look at the next two examples where I think both in the second coming and the third, where there are two instances of, in the second where somebody is trying to integrate the history into something called a national history, and then the third where Munnu is trying to break what we know as history, right? So in that case, don't you think, I don't know how to put this, like, so don't you think this is a kind of, like, especially in terms of Munnu, for example, they break history, like, so how we sometimes see comics as archiving history by bringing in the perspective of Munnu, or in the opposite sense novel, kind of break that tradition, and thus they make the comics not historical or not witnessing. They try to break the tradition of witnessing.
Wait, I'm not sure I got that. Are you saying that with something like Munnu, he's trying to break the tradition of witnessing?
In a way, I was trying to think that whether if, let's say, we generally look at comics, especially in the modern sense, how they can be, how they can represent different ideas of witnessing, right, of history. So if we see that later two novels as examples of that, they're trying to break the kind of history that, let's say, Amar Chitra Katha is trying to make, right?
Yes.
Is it like that?
Yes, I would say Munnu particularly is trying to, in some sense, set itself against this kind of pan-national hegemonic kind of history, right? And say instead, here we should be concentrating on a very specific history, a very specific community, a very specific kind of experience as well, right? Because, but I wouldn't say, in fact, Munnu depends quite heavily on the fact that our protagonist acts as both as a sort of active witness, right? He's both witnessing history as it goes, but he's also testifying to that history when he's creating the comic. And we see so many examples of him making, right? So I think I don't think it's easy to sort of say, yes, he's pro-history or yes, he's anti-history, right? He sees it as something, there is a certain value to it, right? There's a value to a historical narrative that can convey a certain experience. But he is in some ways damaged by it. He's sort of ambiguous about it, which is why it's both the project that he's engaged in, but also something that he's, we see moments of him saying, I'm just going to break it, this is no use. So, does that sort of answer your question?
Just as a further adding it, how we often see the word history as one kind of story that is a kind of story that we read. So can we also say that these characters, like especially Munnu, and then in the second comic, for example, these are not very mainstream characters, right? They're trying to see the society or history from the sidelines, especially. So I was thinking, does that entail a kind of pause or a breakage in the idea of the word history as we know it, like that treating the story as we know it? In some sense, because they are trying to come from the periphery and in various ways trying to make their voices like heard or.
I think partly that, but in Sajad's case, I think the comic is fairly explicit in centering Kashmiri history and specifically Munnu's family history from the beginning, right? I mean, from that map we see where we see Kashmir, not the rest of India, right? Just Kashmir. And the way, again, right, the constant use of maps to locate each thing that's happening, the constant use of the way characters are brought in, right? So I'm not good, so in that sense, he is sort of engaged on this project of centering his personal Kashmiri history, if that helps.
I'm not sure if you answered that, but I just want to know, like, why you chose these 3 particular comics and not others?
The short answer is because I think I had time to do more, so I picked these 3. But I think also for me, all 3 were interesting because they are characteristic of particular ways in which history is constructed in Indian comics, right? So Shivaji then becomes the template for a whole host of Amar Katha histories. Munnu is also something that is drawing upon, I think, a lot of the contemporary narratives that aim to do this, right? Pick fraught kinds of historical moments. This side, that side is an example of that, right? Picking sort of these fraught historical moments and trying to tell them via individual subjectivities rather than so and so on. So they were also partly picked as sort of representative samples of comics, I would say, of comics that are dealing with history in a particular way.
Shalini, my question was about how you used the map throughout as a motive or a metaphor. Right. So I'm trying to look at the map today as something. So this is basically a form of question. Right? So looking at the map today as something that we get via satellite imaging, objective visual techniques of capturing something, versus during Shivaji's time probably when a map was made out of a territorial expansion, etc. So I also don't know the Shivaji comic, but yesterday when Professor Crystal was giving her lecture on borders and territorial disputes as represented in cartoons by say Lakshmana Shankar. We saw India-China conflict, we saw the Sri Lanka border conflict. So there we were looking at how there is a material evincing and an insertion of a subjective interpretation of this. But when we look at the map itself as an image that is revealed over here, like, do you find, how are the maps in the Shivaji comic versus maybe in Munnu? Like, do they use actually represent the maps as they would have been imagined by these map artists of the time, because the way the map has evolved itself is different because of the differing technologies, right? So how does the artist reinterpret those in these comics?
Thank you. That's a nice question. And actually, there are other comics which have photographic maps, but I think in all three comics that I was talking about, maps, because all three are sort of deeply inscribed with making, right? Someone making something by the sword, by the hand, by the pen, whatever. And in Malgu's case, by song. All three of them have the maps sort of verge on they're not realistic maps, right? They're not accurate maps. If you superimpose the Google Maps of either Kashmir or the Sayadri Hills or the Narmada Valley, there would be no point of meeting, right? Because I think for whatever reason, all three of these are comics that think about space as malleable. Right? They think about, and as we've said, they're all also tinged with, right? When they say history, there's a whole load of other kinds of narratives, right? Mythological, legendary, just the sort of popular icon, all of this sort of woven in. So accuracy, being able to find your way, is really not the purpose of any of these maps, right? It's about representing a certain notion of the space. So if in River of Stories, the notion of the space is sort of, it's folkloric, right? This happened in this location. Here is where the Narmada springs up. This is the story behind it, right? So it's sort of restoring that, what would have been an objective map, and turning it into a completely different kind of object, I would say. Does that make sense?
So my question is, I have two questions. So one is from the title of your talk. So the title is History Making Heroes. So we know that the idea of hero as a part in the collective imagination, and also there is an act of validation from the part. So in case of Shivaji, there is that validation process, but do you think in case of Munnu, is it the act of heroism or the subversion of the collective imagination of stereotypical hero image?
So in Malgu's case, I would actually argue that the narrative does validate him, right? Because here, when his community feels like the river has changed beyond their recognition, it's his act of retelling the story, right? He retells multiple stories set along the river valley. And in some ways, that is validating the story, right? It's his map that becomes the centerpiece of the comic rather than an official map. So in Malgu's case, there is a certain kind of narrative validation for the way in which he's making the history. In the case of Munnu, validation is, I won't say validation, but there's a certain, how do I put it? There's this certain idea. There's a certain combativeness to Munnu, right? He's setting himself up against sort of orthodox mainstream histories, and with mixed success, I would say. But the fact that he is setting himself against that, right? And again, the comic ends on a fairly positive note, right? He says he's gone from Munnu, the innocent boy who undergoes all these things, to Sajad, right? Someone who identifies, says, I'm a comics artist, I make comics art, right? So there is a certain kind of narrative validation going on there as well. It's not like being coronated, of course not, but it's quite a more personal kind of narrative validation.
And the second question is regarding Shivaji. So as you said, it's primarily made for the child. So a child who is reading the history of Shivaji, quote unquote, textbook, which bears a picture of Shivaji, and reading down the comics. So how does it shape the sense of history for the child?
I don't actually know, because I'm not sure what textbook we're talking about. It's been a really long time since I was near a textbook.
Is the syllabus?
No, again, I feel like I really haven't looked at a textbook for a very, very long time, so I don't know. But if you have, then maybe you should tell us. Have you been looking at Shivaji in textbooks?
Yes, like it's good. So, what I think that you talked about the map also. So somehow it creates a physical icon of that character, and I haven't read the next book, so I can't tell you what. But if a child hypothetically reads the history of Kashmir along with you, I think that you will get a sense of a multifaceted kind of history. That will be
Maybe. Thank you.
How the writers and the painters of Chitra always claim in various interviews that they focus on a very realistic
so the Amar Chitrakatha writers and painters have claimed that they focus on a realistic representation when it comes to the pictorial or the visual representation. Orijit Sen focuses on a multiplicity of visualization to obviously emphasize on the multiplicity of narratives. And here he focuses on a binary between realistic and abstract. Realistic for the mythical part and abstract for the more factual part of history. And in Munnu, there is a binary between the amount of ink used for portraying the figures with the deer head and the others who are the outsiders and not the people from Kashmir. So can we say that the way the ink is used says something about the act of narrativizing history, since we are talking about that? In all of these three comics, because in Amar Chitrakatha we have seen they have used ink not of the black and white variant, but like other inks as well. Like.
Okay, wait. I think just slight technical correction. I'm just going to think, and then you can continue your question. So, how in traditional comics, and that includes Amar Chitrakatha, how it works is that all the. Hang on, can I show this? So in a comic like this, there is in fact an enormous amount of ink, but it's used to both to outline and to do the shading, right? So the coloring is added after that. So when we say inks, we're really talking about this stuff, right? The hair, the shading here, the shading there, that's the ink.
Yes, my question was in Munnu essentially, the figures with the deer head were fully colored even in the black ink, and the people from outside, the army, were not colored in ink. In the other representations, we find that there is no such deliberate distinction made on the use of the ink to represent these are from this part and they are from outsiders or the insiders. So does it say something about the act of narrativizing history itself? So that was my question.
I think in Munnu that there's a lot that could be said for the depiction of the deer, right? The fact that it's fully inked in is one thing to say about it, but the use of the deer itself as a stand-in for the Kashmiri people, I think it's something that, if it's something you're interested in, there's really a lot that could be said about it. So, but I think it's hard to separate the amount of ink from all the other things that the deer image is doing. So.
Thank you, Prashant.